Um, we are happy to start the first session of the Pediatric COVID-19 Capacity Building Program. And let us hope that we move forward from this, and subsequently we also have something for non-COVID children like this. Because overall, a lot of children do get admitted in the ICU or in the whole hospital. And simple measures, as has been outlined in this, can improve their care. Many a times when I'm called to see a child, I find that fluid charting is not appropriate, the electrolytes management is not looked at correctly, antibiotic doses are not appropriate. So it is very important that we are conducting this session today. So let's hope that by doing this, we improve the overall care of pediatric patients in SGPGI. Over to you, Kirti. I'll stop sharing my screen.
So, thank you, ma'am, for the introduction. So, as you have seen the program, we will go one by one, and it is just a brief overview of what we are going to talk about and how you approach when a child present to emergency, in this case, a T3 area. So, let me share my slides first. Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
So the first talk will be about how to recognize a sick child present in the T3 area. Because we are going, mainly this is because we are talking about anticipated third wave of COVID-19. So how to identify such a sick child. So I'll be covering my talk under the following headings. I'll be telling about the structured approach that we use, and I think many of the residents will be familiar with this approach. Then just what is abnormal vitals among the children, some of the red sign and red flags, and then followed by a chart about triage of COVID-19 child. So identification of a sick child involves a structured approach, and there are 3 steps that we have to see. One is to evaluate for any abnormal signs or symptoms in the child. The second is, after identification of any abnormal signs, you have to intervene with appropriate measures. So this is a bit of a lengthy, if I cover everything, it will become very lengthy. So I will be focusing mainly on how to evaluate a sick child, or what are the steps of evaluation of a sick child. So it comprises of the following assessments. First is the initial assessment, followed by primary, then secondary assessment, and at the end, the diagnostic test that will be required. So this talk will only cover the steps of evaluation. So coming to the initial assessment. So the initial assessment is the assessment when the child enters the pediatric emergency or the T3 area. So it is basically a visual and auditory responses of the child that will tell you that whether the child is really sick and what interventions or how, without touching, this is initial assessment, without touching the child, you will be able to identify which is a sick child. So that is the simplest way that we can do it. So this is a pediatric assessment triangle, and it comprises of 3 components. One is the appearance. Appearance is basically a marker of your primary brain dysfunction. The second one is the work of breathing, which signifies a respiratory problem. And third one is the color or circulation to the skin, which signifies your circulatory dysfunction if any abnormal thing is present. So the first component of appearance of a child, when at the door when the child is there, you have to see for few things. One thing is about the tone of the child, his interactiveness, his whether if the child is small and crying, whether he is consolable, his look or gaze of the child, and speech. So one can remember this by the mnemonic tickles. And if any of this abnormal, or suppose the child is posturing and so it is abnormal tone, you find he is very flexed or very extended. His interaction with surroundings or with you is decreased. He is continuously crying and not consolable at all, even with the mother. The look is abnormal, or he's just staring at one gaze, and his cry is also abnormal. So if anything is abnormal, that signifies there is a primary brain issue, whatever may be the reason. It is not that it is a primary diagnosis. It just signifies that the physiological status of brain because of any reasons is abnormal. Then the second is the work of breathing. In this, you have to see, you can hear the abnormal sounds. If there's upper airway obstruction, you can hear the stridor of lower airway, or the parenchymal problem. Specifically in the smaller children, you can hear the grunting sounds. Then you can see the chest indrawing or the retractions. And the other thing is work of breathing is increased, so nasal flaring can be seen, or the child is unresponsive and he came gasping to the emergency. So if any of this is abnormal, then obviously the child has a respiratory problem, which is the most likely thing in COVID-19. We will be able to see the respiratory dysfunction if the child is sick. Then the circulation to skin, three things you have to see, whether the skin color is pale or it is cyanose or mottled. That means there is a circulatory dysfunction in this child, and whatever may be the reason. It's not just sepsis. We are not making any diagnosis on this. We are just making what is the physiological status of the child when he has entered your emergency. So after the initial assessment, you can categorize the child into stable when all the three are normal, and or unstable. In unstable, it can be life-threatening or not life-threatening. Life-threatening means he is unresponsive and not breathing, and he requires immediate attention in the form of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And not life-threatening means any one of these abnormal and he requires further evaluation. So just by the look of the child and his sounds, if he is making anything, you will be able to know that this child is stable or unstable. So even if you can identify that much, that will help you in deciding the further thing, whether he requires admission or whether he does not require admission and further management. So this is very important. If you understand this, that is okay. So I just made it very simplified, but permutation and combination can happen. So COVID-19 on initial impression, how you can triage it just by initial impression, just by three things. So one thing is if in mild COVID-19, the child can, all the three will be normal, and child can just have symptoms of fever and mild rhinorrhea, but his appearance is okay. He's comfortable with the mother. There is no work of breathing and color is normal. So these kind of patients can be advised home isolation, or if there is no facility, then isolation rooms may be provided for them. Then another category is the moderate COVID-19. In this, the child will be having mild increase in work of breathing, but his appearance and color, there is no circulatory problem, there is no brain dysfunction. So these two will be normal, and you can categorize as moderate, and these will be requiring HTU and further oxygen support. And severe COVID-19, all may be not, one or more may be normal or will be abnormal. So child can be drowsy and irritable. There is increased work of breathing, and obviously because he is presently in late, there can be features of a shock, and your skin color will be cyanose, pale or mottled. So these kind of children will require your intensive care in your pediatric ICU. So after the initial assessment, we go to the primary assessment that includes the assessment pentagon, which is nothing but A, B, C, D, E. So A is for the airway, then you evaluate for the airway. Now you touch the child. After initial impression, you touch the child and go evaluate, further evaluate what are the status of A, B, C, D, E. So A is for airway, where you see whether it is open, maintainable or not maintainable. There can be secretions, there can be upper airway problems, and there can be, in smaller children, the neck may be flexed, and this can also hamper his respiration. So you just have to make it in a sniffing position. Then breathing, in this you evaluate for respiratory rate, work of breathing and saturations. In circulation, you have to see for heart rate, capillary refill, blood pressures, peripheral pulses, color and temperature. And in disability, you can use either the GCS scale or the AVPU scale can be used. in children. In exposure, again, you have to see for any rash, redness, or swelling of hand and feet. So in this way, you can do a primary assessment of the child. Secondary assessment comprised of focused history and examination, which can be remembered with the help of sample mnemonic. Sample is signs and symptoms, A is allergies, medications in the past, or there are P is for past medical history, which means that are there any comorbidities. L is the last meal taken. This is important for planning sedation for intubation if the child is in life-threatening situation or other procedures. Then for planning intubation, sedation in intubation for patient with respiratory failure. And then E is the events, what has brought this child to the emergency room. So in a COVID situation, the signs and symptoms could be fever, cough, running nose, decreased urine output, and poor feeding. Again, this is self-explanatory. M is for medication prior to coming to our hospital. You can take that history and any associated comorbidities. Again, this last meal and events leading to admission. In addition to this sample, you may add this point of positive history of contact with COVID. And the focused examination is general examination from head to toe, and your respiratory system is main system which is involved in the COVID patients. Then comes the diagnostic test is the last thing, and only in moderate to severe cases we should go with these diagnostic stick that will be discussed further in your protocol presentation. Coming to what are the normal and abnormal vitals in children. The normal temperature range in children is around 36.6 to 37.9. So any of this cutoffs above is abnormal. And you do get hypothermia in children. It is not like that you will not only get fever in COVID patient, but smaller children who can get hypothermia as well, can present in emergency. So the heart rate cutoffs for children include less than 60 bradycardia at all age groups. For an infant means up to 1 year of age, more than 220 beats per minute will classify it into tachyarrhythmia, but up to 220 beats per minute will be tachycardia appropriate for the clinical condition. So the normal range are different in awake and quiet state. So that will be shown in the table. But more than 220 in infant and more than 180 in child is tachyarrhythmias. So these are the normal heart rate ranges. So as you can see in the awake status, in the smaller kids will have a higher heart rate. As the child grows up, the heart rate is lower, on the lower side. So the respiratory cutoffs are for neonates, which is up to 28 days, it's more than 60. From 2 months to 12 months, that is 1 year of age, it is 50 per minute, and after 1 to 5 years, it is 40, and after that, the school age, that is 6 to 12 years, it is more than 30, and adolescent is more than 25. There are formulas for blood pressures, so I'll just go through it. For children, we just have to see the systolic blood pressure in emergency. So less than 60 is for neonates, the cutoff for hypotension, and less than 70 for infant. For older children, the formula is 70 plus age in years into 2, and for more than 10 years or in adolescent is less than 90. Saturation cutoff is less than 94% all ages except for neonates, which is less than 95%. These are some of the danger signs or the red flags, which is persistent high-grade fever for more than 3 days, saturations less than 94%, cyanosis, higher respiratory rate as per the age, chest indrawing, and feature of misty. The danger signs in smaller children can be not able to, poor feeding, not able to breastfeed or drink, or he's vomiting whatever he's taken. Convulsions are there, and lethargy, or child is unconscious. I'll just show this video, which is our Dr. Banani has given me to this man, has this repository. So this is a child who is presented to our hospital, and I'll just play it first and then describe. So just look at the child. If you just have to do initial impression. So are there any volunteers who can just tell me what is the initial impression for this child? Anybody can unmute themselves and tell. I will do it 20 seconds. Maybe I can play again. Please just tell me the initial impression for this child. Just the pediatric assessment plan.
Child is having altered sensorium with increased respiratory rate with subcostal and intercostal retractions.
So what is your initial impression?
Severe pneumonia.
No, that is not in your initial. Whether we are not going into diagnosis. Initial impression is not for the diagnosis. It is just to identify the physiological status of the child. Whether it is stable, unstable.
Unstable.
Unstable, life-threatening, not life-threatening.
Unstable. And saturation.
So he is unstable. You are very right. This child is having increased work of breathing.
1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, Kirti. If you say the saturation is 100%.
No, we are not looking at saturation.
No, I'm just telling her. That's what I want her to understand.
Okay.
It was Hasina who was answering. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
So Hasina, that's important to see. Even without looking at the saturation, looking at the other parameters, you can say that this child is extremely critical. She'll explain why. Go ahead, Kirti.
Yes. So this child has, as you can see, appearance is not normal. She looks lethargic and drowsy. And work of breathing is there. You can see some mild retractions, subcostal and intercostal, as well as the color. Though in this video you may not be very much sure, but the color looks absolutely like pink. She is looking pink. She's not looking cyanos, and she's not looking very pale also. So at least two systems are problematic here. So obviously this child is unstable, but the situation is not life-threatening. That means she's not unresponsive, and she might be unresponsive, but she's breathing. She's not. So both these two things has to be there: unresponsive and not breathing. Then it becomes a life-threatening situation. Okay, then we'll have to start the CPR. So this child, because probably she was also on oxygen, so her saturation is 99 and her heart rate is 139. So this is how you can just, on the initial impression, identify the physiological status of the child and decide whether he is requiring admission or not requiring admission. So that is the only aim. So this is the last slide. So how you triage the symptomatic COVID-19, I have already explained in the initial impression, but the rest of the things like mild, moderate, severe will be dealt up in the protocol of STPJ of pediatric COVID-19. So I think I will not go into details in there. Thank you so much. Are there any questions? If there are no more questions, I think the second session, the second talk can be started, ma'am. Dr. Anita.
Yes, Kirti. Sure.
So Dr. Anita will be talking about oxygen delivery devices.
Hello, a very good afternoon to everyone. Is my screen visible and I'm audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So this second lecture is about oxygen therapy in children, and I think my job is much easier because we all have, just a minute. Yeah. So we all have worked in this COVID pandemic, and oxygen is something which we have been used to, and lot of information about this oxygen therapy has been discussed with anesthesia also in previous capacity building sessions. So we will again go through this oxygen delivery devices and a few differences and charts about what changes are there required in the when we consider for the children's. So the topic would be covered under indication for oxygen therapy, sources of oxygen therapy, devices used for oxygen delivery, assessment of oxygen status, and appropriate target. So indication include central cyanosis. It is like visibly you are seeing that the child is looking blue. So that is the clinical judgment. Then hypoxemia as indicated by SpO2, that is mostly taken as less than 94% to initiate. And if you have most of the time it is instant by pulse oximetry, but then blood gas parameter include less than 80 millimeters of mercury in child. Then over and above, if you have a child who is having a respiratory distress, irrespective of oxygen saturation, you first start oxygen. So sources of oxygen therapy include, it could be in an emergency setup by cylinder, then oxygen concentrator, mostly they have variable flows, and depending on that, they have variable oxygen concentration. Then in hospitals, we are having advantage of having central pipeline, and through which we connect all of our system to provide the delivery through interface. So choice of delivery system would depend, interface would depend on the age of the child. In newborns, there are some specific methods, and in the children's, there would be other methods. Then degree of hypoxemia. So if you are having a severely hypoxemic child, then you, of course, your oxygen delivery devices would be others in comparison to when the magnitude of hypoxemia is less. Then over and above, if you have associated respiratory distress, then of course you would like to indicate to initiate the patient on breathing support, which gives some comfort to the associated work of breathing as well. So the classification system for oxygen delivery devices include low flow system and high flow system. The low flow and high flow is basically dependent on the patient's respiratory demand. So if your oxygen delivery devices are providing the flow lesser than the patient respiratory demand, they are classified as low flow, and vice versa for the high flow. So in the low flow system, basically we would discuss about nasal prong, face mask, partial rebreathing mask, and non-rebreathing mask. In high flow system, we would discuss about venturi mask, oxygen hood, and high flow nasal cannula. So coming to the low flow devices. So this is about oxygen prongs. So it is a simple oxygen prong which fits into the nurse, and they are attached with oxygen tubing, which can be connected to the either blender, oxygen cylinder, or the central oxygen source. Flow is usually taken as 0.25 to 4 liters per minute, and in this nasopharynx acts as reservoir. If we have to give more than 2 liters per minute flow, then of course humidification should be tried. Humidification should be applied. And if you increase the rate more than 6 liters per minute, then there is no advantage of having a increase in FiO2. So depending on the flow rate, we have this chart to indicate how much oxygen FiO2 we can deliver. So mostly they can by 6 liters per minute, they can provide up to 40 to 45% of oxygen. Then these are simple face masks. So they have plastic mask with 2 side ports. They don't have any valve, and flow rate is around 5 to 8 liters per minute. Minimum flow rate should be up to 5 liters per minute, and at more than 8, there is no extra advantage of having additional FiO2. So depending on the flow rate, at 5 to 6 liters per minute, we have 40% oxygen FiO2 delivered. At 6 to 7, we have 50%, and at 7 to 8, we have 60%. Then coming to the partial rebreathing mask. So these masks has 2 exhalation ports on this side and other side, and a reservoir mask which doesn't have any valve. So what happens in this, that in this reservoir, both inspiratory and inspiratory and expiratory gases mixes, and the oxygen concentration is a bit lesser than the non-rebreathing mask, which we are going to discuss in subsequent slides. So they have advantage over the simple face mask of oxygen, which, and they should be using a flow rate of more than 8 liters per minute, and FiO2 generated would be 60 to 80%. Then coming to the non-rebreathing mask, so these masks has valves in these ports. So these are expiratory ports, and this reservoir they also have port. So this reservoir only contains oxygen, and it is important that while we attach this mask to the oxygen, we should look for the inflation of this bag. Otherwise, all the advantages lost. So we should keep on checking that this reservoir is getting inflated with the oxygen delivery, and flow rate is mostly around 12 to 15 liters per minute. So FiO2 up to 80 to 90% is generated with these masks, and they are mostly used in the severe hypoxemic conditions. So coming to the high flow devices. So this is oxygen hood. So if you have a newborn or a small infant, we can give the oxygen through this hood kind of oxygen delivery system. And they are coming into mostly 3 sizes: small, medium, and large. So often there are side holes in this oxygen hoods, and through these holes we can, if we close one port, then we can give a FiO2 of 40 to 50%, and if both ports are closed, up to 80 to 90% oxygen can be delivered. So flow rate should be kept as mostly more than 5 liters per minute. It is often seen that many people give this oxygen hood in place and they keep the flow rate of up to 2 liters per minute. So that is not correct. The flow rate should be more than 5 liters per minute. Then coming to the Venturi mask, this mask has the advantage of high FiO2 delivery system and a fixed performance, that the FiO2 is generally not variable as with all the high flow systems. So they have a jet orifice and air entrapment port, and they have various color masks, and depending on the color code, the FiO2 is generated. So these masks, this Venturi mask comes in these colors, and according to this chart, we can get from 24% to 60% of oxygen can be delivered. Then high flow cannula system, so what we called as HHFNC. So these are the system which are used from the neonate to the adult, and the flow rate is generally 2 liters per kg. In pediatric, mostly flow starts from 8 to 20 liters per minute, and it achieves a FiO2 of around 70 to 100%. And by virtue of flow rates, it can generate some amount of peak in positive and expiratory pressure. So they can be helpful in children's or infants where there is a associated work of breathing. So they are heated, they are humidified, and they can give some amount of PEEP as well. So this is the simple, mostly these high flow cannula systems has different machines, and they have their own nasal cannulas. Simple modification is also comes in the name of RAMS cannula, which can be connected with some connectors. So this is one of the cannula which connects to the airbow make of the high flow system. And according to the color coding, they have different color for the newborn baby, the premature baby, the infant, and the green for the pediatric. So this is for the one make. Depending on the other companies, they can be different sizes of the cannula. This chart I have included for the targeting FiO2. So if we give the FiO2 through high flow system or through a BiPAP machine or CPAP machine or ventilator, then they have integrated blender and mixing in that, so that we can control and monitor FiO2. But if you don't have a blender, then through oxygen and air port, we can adjust the flow, and then we can target the FiO2. So suppose in the example, I said the flow of 4 liters of air and 4 liters of oxygen, then oxygen delivered is 60%. So similarly at 5 and 3, it is around 70%. So this is a chart which can guide us that even without having a blender, we can adjust the air and oxygen sources, and by which we can avoid the oxygen toxicity and target the precise FiO2. So assessment of oxygen, it includes, it can be clinical. You can clinically see whether the baby looks blue or cyanotic. Then SpO2 is continuous and non-invasive way, which we all do in our wards or ICUs, and PaO2 in the blood gas. And mostly the normal range would be 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury, and then P/F ratio and S/F ratio. Appropriate targets Generally, we should target more than 90%, 4% in children when they are being treated in ICU or HTOs, and the target would be 90 to 95% in neonates because they have inherent vulnerability for the oxygen-free radicals injury in form of retinopathy or bronchopulmonary dysplasia. So this chart, just to summarize, this includes a picture for the blow by oxygen as well. So if a child or infant is irritable, just a conical kind of paper can be attached to the oxygen tubing, and they can just keep it around the baby's face. Then this is the oxygen through hood. This is simple nasal cannula. This is simple mask. This is neon rebreathing mask, and this is Venturi mask, and this is the high flow nasal cannulas. So in summary, the blow by oxygen, you can give the flow rate of 10 liters per minute, and a lot of oxygen is wasted in this. But if they can be comforted by in mother's lap, and oxygen FiO2 generally less than 40%. So small children requiring low flow FiO2 can be given by this. Nasal cannula up to 2 to 4 liters per minute. The FiO2 range is 25 to 40%, and it can be used in all age groups. Oxygen hood is around 6 to 10 liters per minute. FiO2 varies from 25 to 90%, and it should be used in neonates and in small infants. Simple masks at 5 to 8 liters per minute, 35 to 50% of the FiO2 child and adolescent. Venturi mask 3 to 50 liters per minute, range is 24 to 60% in child and adolescent. Non-rebreathing mask around 6 to 15 liters per minute, 60 to 90% of FiO2 child and adolescent, and high flow nasal cannula system. For the child, it is up to 2 to 20 liters per minute, and 40 to 100% oxygen can be delivered by, and it is suitable for all ages. So how to titrate or
Anita, I think you stop. It's
yes,
too much. Just stop it. No, stop it.
Okay.
Stop it. Enough. And next time, I think you should cut out all the things that they already do in adults, because you just talk about hood, you talk about HFNC because that is different, and you talk about bubble CPAP because those are the things which are different. The rest are the same, except that the size of the mask will be different. Otherwise, we'll never finish. Okay.
Yeah.
It was very, very good otherwise. Anybody wants to ask anything? Sorry for the interruption, but it's already 4. At this rate, we'll not finish. Okay. Right. I'll share my screen. And I just realized that actually Amita should have been doing this. She's the one who's made this. She's made it last time also. She's again made it this time. Thank you, Amita. As we have all agreed, RCH2 will be the place where we look after the children and those who are below 12. So up to 12 will come here and 12 to 18 will go there. So there is no difference in triage. We are hoping that we will not have a triage in RCH2, but we'll have to convince the director for that. Testing criteria, same. Quarantine, other protocols, same. Major difference while managing a child. This is very important that all of you should know this, that one adult has to accompany the child in the COVID hospital, and for this, the consent form will have to be signed. So the consent form is also attached here. This is the consent form, and the mother or the father, whoever is going inside with the child, will sign this, and only then we allow the child to be admitted. This may not be true for children above 12 years, so we don't bother. There is nothing new about our protocol, but just that at times we may forget. So we thought we'll put it down in writing. Category 1 is an asymptomatic patient who is probably just detected to be COVID positive. So just home isolation, observation, and monitoring. Kirti has already talked about the danger signs. So those are the signs that need to be monitored. Here I would just like to say that this time around, we did have a lot of pediatric patients who were positive, and the institute developed a nice system of wellness committee of each department. So I would urge everybody here that if we do have such asymptomatic patients who are COVID positive children, they should be dealt with by the wellness committee members, because there's nothing very different in monitoring adult and a child, except that the danger signs may be more subtle in the child. Category 2, mild disease, only fever, sore throat, cough, diarrhea, etc. No tachypnea. And we all know the definition of tachypnea for a child. Where did that go? Oh, sorry, it's got cut off. It's here. So 0 to 2 months respiratory rate more than 60, 2 to 12 months respiratory rate more than 50, 1 to 5 years more than 40, and more than 5 years more than 30. And again, home treatment and only symptomatic management for fever, a good oral intake to be ensured, and all the danger signs to be taught to the mother or the father, who will then monitor these signs. Moderate illness, tachypnea, and SpO2 fall, but it is above 90%. So it is less than 94, but it is more than 90%. It is greater than 90%, but less than 94. No signs of severe disease, and supplemental oxygen. Patient can be admitted to the hospital. If the parents are willing to keep the child at home and give oxygen and monitor, then that can be done, especially if it's an older child, like 8-10 years, it's fine, because the pulse oximeter probes, the small portable ones, can be used in this age children. Maintain hydration. If there is suspicion of bacterial infection, then only we would like to give amoxicillin clavulanic acid. If the baby is very small, then maybe cefotaxime amikacin. But I think it is better to discuss with one of the faculty members, especially somebody from neonatology. Paracetamol for fever. Steroids are not to be given always, only in case of rapidly progressive disease. So at the onset, if there is a need for oxygen, but the patient does not deteriorate, there is no need to give steroids. Supportive care for any comorbid conditions and monitoring. Investigations here, we would do a full blood count. Inflammatory markers maybe once. Blood gas, depending on how the patient behaves. LFT, KFT, coagulation profile, and chest X-ray. Here I would like to say that these are the cutoff values we will take for inflammatory markers, and all this is already there on the SOP. I myself can never remember these values from the top of my head, so I thought I'd write it in the SOP. Severe disease is at least SpO2 has gone below 90. There is chest indrawing or grunting, cyanosis, altered mental status, and we would have to admit this child, give oxygen as per severity of ARDS, IV fluids, and here is a definite role of dexamethasone, 0.15 milligram per kilogram per dose, 12 hourly, 5 to 14 days. Now, this is a little different from the adults where we were giving only once a day. It says clearly every protocol is saying twice a day, but I suppose one can weigh the pros and cons and then decide. An equivalent dose of methylprednisolone can be used, which means into 5 times. And remdesivir is now practically out, but if somebody is very keen, then it can be used depending upon the condition and if the child is older than 8 years or so. Antibiotics, here we have again talked of ceftriaxone, amikacin, or maybe piperacillin, tazobactam, cefoperazone, sulbactam, whatever the consultant on duty feels, but only and only if there is a strong suspicion of bacterial sepsis. If there is shock or other organ dysfunction, this patient will have to be managed appropriately. Supportive care of comorbid conditions, and again the same kind of investigations. So that is about all our protocol says, and this is the algorithm. So a patient comes, categorized as either suspected or known COVID positive. If it's known COVID positive, category 1 and 2, home isolation, symptomatic treatment, 3 and 4, admit, and depending on whether the patient needs ICU or ward, and manage. And if it is not a known COVID, which we are hoping we will not get, then of course sampling and then subsequently decide. Now, one more thing that is important here, which will probably, oh, where is that? The MISC thing. Okay. It had come in the other minutes, but it's not come here. If the patient tests negative for COVID or is an MISC who is negative for COVID, then again, this patient will have to be shifted to one of the wards, and that will be taken up on a day of the week basis, between Monday to Friday, Saturday, and all the Sundays will be taken by rotation. So one day is ped gastro, one day is genetics, one day is neonatology, one day is CCM, one day is hematology, and so on and so forth. So that also needs to come into the protocol. I'm sorry that's not there. I'll add it. The other is the MISC protocol. And I think pediatric gastro is becoming the expert in managing this. So the diagnostic criteria, I think everybody is kind of gone through this several times, but just for the sake of repetition, we'll see it once again. So fever has to be there for more than 3 days. Any two of these, that is rash or bilateral conjunctivitis or mucocutaneous inflammation, hypotension or shock, features of myocardial dysfunction, pericarditis, valvulitis, or coronary abnormalities, evidence of coagulopathy, mostly an elevated D-dimer, acute GI problem like diarrhea, vomiting, abdominal pain. So mostly what we are getting is fever, rash, and all of you must have attended that very interesting presentation by Dr. Suresh from PGI Chandigarh, where he had highlighted all the clinical features and the lab markers that they had seen. So elevated markers of inflammation, ESR, CRP, ProCal is a must. And no other obvious microbial cause of inflammation, including bacterial sepsis. And one should be very wary of staph or streptococcal infections. And evidence of COVID RT-PCR, COVID-19 in the form of either an antigen test or serology positive, which is the most likely, or a history of contact with patients with COVID. Like right now, there is a child in ped gastro, one of our own faculty members' child. 1 month ago, their family, everybody had COVID, and now this child has come with high-grade fever and probably increased inflammatory markers. So tier 1 and tier 2, basically, tier 1 is CRP, ESR, and a lymphocyte count. Look for also neutropenia, hypoalbuminemia. And if at all anything is suspected, then we would go for a cardiac markers. And along with that, SARS serology, and of course, common tropical infections. It's very important because these can all mimic the condition that has been said. So basically, we look at it like this. If you have these with an epidemiological link to SARS-CoV-2, if you do not have that, then you evaluate for something else. If you have it, then you look for whether there are any life-threatening manifestations. What is important is some patients with MISC need not be so sick, and it is likely that it is possible that they can just be having high-grade fever and raised inflammatory markers, but nothing else. So if there is no organ dysfunction, you don't need to jump up and down and do anything for these patients. You just need to monitor them. In fact, many of these patients can just have a very low grade fever. So tier 1 evaluation, and if any of these are positive, then you go for tier 2 evaluation and also work up for common tropical infections. And I would say also look for signs of other infections like staph and strep. And if they fulfill the diagnostic criteria for MIC, here the first line of treatment is IVIG. And also you start low dose methylprednisolone, that is 1 to 2 milligram per kilogram per day. Antimicrobials as and when you think they're necessary, or maybe if you would like to cover for any particular infection like say scrub or dengue or maybe staphylococcal disease. And also at this time, the patient requires a echocardiography. And if in case there is on echocardiography, there is any evidence of enlarged coronaries or anything, then this patient becomes a candidate for either methylprednisolone, repeat IVIG, or this is also if the patient is not improving. And aspirin and enoxaparin have got some very specific indications. Thrombocytosis or coronary aneurysm with a Z score of greater than 2.5, then we start aspirin. And if in case the Z score is more than 10 or there is thrombosis or LV ejection fraction is less than 35%, then enoxaparin is also started in a almost therapeutic dose. Now, steroids are tapered over 2 to 3 weeks while monitoring for inflammatory markers. And of course, we repeat monitoring every now and then. And maybe the inflammatory markers can be monitored over every 48 hours or every 24 hours. So that is the way the MIC management would go. And I hope that we all become experts in this. I don't know. I don't know whether I hope, but I suppose we should see a lot because other centers are seeing a lot of patients. Right. So we move on to the next, that is Siddharth, fluids and electrolytes. Over to you, Siddharth.
Yes, ma'am. Are my slides visible?
Yeah.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I will be talking about fluid
Yeah.
and electrolytes management in children with COVID-19.
Siddharth, you muted yourself by mistake.
Okay, ma'am.
Ah.
So let's start with the replacement fluid, which is also known as bolus fluid. So it's needed when there is a state of hypovolemia or dehydration, or if there is a frank hypotension or shock. So either of the normal saline or ringer lactate can be used. But I would like to emphasize that in a state of definitive shock with a established poor tissue perfusion, normal saline should be preferred over anything else. How much to give? So in different conditions, we use different volume at different rate. Like for frank hypovolemia and septic shock, we can use a higher volume, 20 ml per kg, given rapidly over 5 to 10 minutes, can be repeated 2 to 3 times. For other hypovolemic situations, not in frank shock, we can use the same volume a bit slower over 30 minutes. In a state of renal failure or when you are unsure of urine output, we use even lower volume given over 1 hour. And for cardiac failure, we use 5 to 10 ml per kg given very slowly over 1 hour. Now, coming to maintenance fluids. So it's needed when you have given a bolus to a sick child in a hypovolemic or hypotensive child, and then you need it for maintenance fluid therapy. Then we use maintenance fluid. Or in any sick child who is unable to take orally, we use maintenance fluid. Which fluid to be preferred? So to make it simple, we use either of these two fluids. For younger children, we use half normal saline with 5% dextrose and KCl. For older children, we use normal saline with 5% dextrose and KCl. So I would like to emphasize that this Isolite has been widely conceptualized as a pediatric fluid, maintenance fluid, but as per current recommendations, it should not be used after the neonatal period. How much to give? So this is the famous Holiday-Segar Segar formula. With this formula, we calculate and we give the fluid accordingly. A special mention in the case of renal failure, we supplement the insensible loss as 500 ml per meter square body surface area with 5% dextrose. And if there is any urine output, we replace them with half normal saline. Now coming to colloids, its role is for as a volume expander when there is a crystalloid refractory hypovolemic status. There are so many colloids like dextran 40, dextran 70, hetastat, etc. But there is no good safety data for their use in pediatric age group. So generally they are not recommended very much and they should be avoided. But if at all it has to be used in some conditions, only albumin should be used. We have to take care regarding giving albumin that in our hospital, it's only available as 20% in albumin, not the lower concentration 4 or 5% albumin. So it must be given very slowly. So dose is 0.5 to 1 gram per kg, and 1 gram is the maximum dose, and it has to be given very slowly at the rate of 2 ml per hour in younger children less than 10 kg weight, and at the rate of 5 ml per hour in older children. Grossly, you can give the whatever be the calculated dose, we can give it over 24 hours period as a slow infusion. Coming to blood products, so I will be talking very briefly about PRBC and FFP transfusion. So these are the indications regarding PRBC transfusion. I would like to emphasize upon the dose. It's 10 ml per kg, and it has to be given slowly in children over 3 to 4 hours with Lasix cover. We give Lasix 1 mg per kg once after the transfusion. FFP should be given in it's given in many coagulation factor deficiency status, which may be seen in liver disease, vitamin K deficiency, and DIC kind of a status. And the dose is 10 to 15 ml per kg, and it has to be given very slowly over 2 to 3 hours, and again with the Lasix cover. So sodium bicarbonate, we use this in state of severe acidosis when pH is 7.1 or there is cardiac dysfunction due to severe acidosis. It's available as 7.5 or 8.4% solution, which gives approximately 1 milliequivalent per ml of soda bicarb. So how much to give? This is the formula for dose calculation. It's 0.3 into base capsid into body weight. And half of this calculated dose, it has to be given over 6 to 8 hours. And then we have to reassess before giving the remaining dose. One thing we have to take care of that it's a hypertonic solution. It's like a 7.5% saline solution. So it's very hypertonic. So it should be given in diluted form with equal volume of distilled water or 3 to 5 times volume of 5% dextrose. So it should be given diluted and slowly. Now hypoglycemia. So hypoglycemia is defined as blood sugars less than 70 milligram per deciliter. Severe hypoglycemia is less than 40 milligram per deciliter. And this may cause even seizure, coma, or death. Management wise, we use 10% dextrose. It can be used through peripheral lines. In neonates and infants, the dose is 2 ml per kg IV bolus, and older children is 5 ml per kg IV bolus. The 25% dextrose higher concentration, it should be given only through central line, and the dose is 1 to 2 ml per kg IV as a bolus. Post giving the bolus, we have to give the maintenance. This is a formula of GIR calculation. So in this, we must know the GIR required. In infants, GIR is 6 to 12 mg per kg per minute, and older children, it's less, like 3 to 6 mg per kg per minute. So what we have to do, we have to calculate this. In most conditions, we have to calculate this, the fluid rate. So for calculating this, we rearrange this formula. As if we know the GIR, we use the determined GIR here, and we use the dextrose concentration whether we are using 5% dextrose or 10% dextrose, and then we calculate this thing and we give it in we give the desired fluid, the desired dextrose fluid in as per this rate. Now coming to hyponatremia. and hypernatremia. So hyponatremia, as we know that it's defined as serum sodium less than 135 milliequivalent per liter. Severe hyponatremia is less than 120 milliequivalent per liter. So, but when we correct it, the target is not 135 or 145, the target is 130. And the experts advise not to correct even beyond 120 in case of chronic case of severe hyponatremia. A chronic case means duration more than 40 to 48 hours, or some say 72 hours. And the correction target in 24 hours should not be more than 10 to 12 milliequivalent per liter per day to avoid osmotic demyelination. And for chronic hyponatremia, it's even lower. It's 6 to 8 milliequivalent per liter per day. So we have to calculate the sodium deficit, which has to be corrected over next 24 hours. So we calculate it as a 0.6 into body weight into the target sodium, which is 130, or it may depend upon how much max we have to correct in a day, and the actual sodium. So if we take an example like a 25 kg old boy with serum sodium 110, we assume it's acute hyponatremia, and so we cannot correct it till 130, and it will exceed the limit. So we want to correct it 120. And if it would have been a chronic hyponatremia, we would not have wanted to correct even till 120. So in this case, if we want to correct it by 10 till 120, then the deficit would be like 150 milliequivalent. To give this 150 milliequivalent of sodium over next 24 hours would require either 1 liter of normal saline, which is 154 milliequivalent per liter, or 300 ml of 3% saline, that is thrice the concentration over next 24 hours. This 3 ml saline, mostly NS is preferred. This 3% saline is not used in most conditions, but it can be used in cases of hypervolemic hyponatremia. And it's more commonly it's used in severe symptomatic hyponatremia when we want to correct serum sodium rapidly to avoid life-threatening condition. In this case, we use 3% saline at the rate of 3 ml per kg IV bolus over 30 minutes, which may be repeated, and then the maintenance saline. And we must evaluate for the etiological possibilities like SIDH and CSW, as the specific etiology may warrant specific management protocols. Coming to hyponatremia, it's defined as serum sodium more than 145. So management, again, we have to have a target sodium that's 140 milliequivalent per liter. And again, per day, we should not correct more than this. We calculate free water deficit using this formula. So again, we have taken an example like for a 40 kg old boy, serum sodium 175. So if we put everything here, the free water deficit is 6 liters, and this free water should be replaced with either IV dextrose, or we can give water per oral or through NG tube. You can use a very hypotonic saline, but again, there is a formula for that. For that, we have to calculate the actual volume of that hypotonic saline, but generally that's not preferred. We have to correct it with IV dextrose. So here we have to note that this free water deficit of 6 liters has been calculated for a total correction of 35 milliequivalent per liter. So we cannot correct this in 1 day. So it should be corrected in 3 days. So this 6 liters of free water we would give over the period of 3 days. And again, in this case also, we have to evaluate for etiology and consider specific management consideration according to specific etiology. So etiological evaluation is a must in all these cases. Now coming to hypokalemia, so it's less than 3.5 milliequivalent per liter is hypokalemia. We correct when there are ECG changes. If there is central venous excess, we give neat potassium chloride 0.15 ml per kg per hour undiluted. That's neat. And if central venous excess is not there, then we see at the ECG. When ECG is showing frank evidence of hypokalemia, that's U wave and absent T wave, then we give concentrated KCl like 10 ml of KCl with 90 ml of normal saline, and we run with this rate till the ECG findings disappear. But when ECG findings are not there, then we just increase the potassium concentration in the maintenance fluid from 1:100 to 2 ml per 100 ml, or a max of 3 ml per 100 ml. This KCl it could be life-threatening, so we have to keep a very strict monitoring, ECG monitoring while giving this, and we have to reassess every 3 to 4 hours so that we don't overdo, and that could be life-threatening. And in an anuric child, we should never use KCl infusion. In a case of significant hypokalemia, always look for hypomagnesemia, and it's given in the dose of 0.2 ml per kg per dose. and it has to be added to IV fluids and given over 1 to 2 hours, or maybe given as a separate infusion over 1 to 2 hours. Never give as IV push. Hyperkalemia, again, we treat in infants till 6 millicurie per liter. We don't need to treat, but we treat it only if there is EC changes are visible. We all know these algorithms. We use multiple strategies to bring down the potassium, like some strategies to halt potassium intake, and then we use calcium chloride or calcium gluconate to stabilize cell membranes, and then to translocate potassium intracellularly, we use sodium bicarbonate if there is concurrent acidosis, or we use insulin with dextrose infusion in these dosage, or beta-2 agonist inhalation. And we use this caxylate for elimination, as well as diuretics and sometimes dialysis in severe cases. In both hypokalemia and hyperkalemia, the etiological workup is a must, because there could be some specific etiology which may warrant specific management protocols. So these are the common drugs. These drugs should be very handy with all of us, and I would not go details of each of the drugs. It's a list within the handbook also. So like dexamethasone, ma'am just said that 0.15 mg per kg per dose. OD or BD, there is some, like CDC says OD and our Ministry of Health guidelines says BD, but okay, it will depend upon the clinical status. And the equivalent dose of methylprednisolone or prednisolone can be used. Remdesivir 5 mg per kg on day 1, followed by 2.5 mg per kg once daily for 4 days. All the dosage we know. This enoxaparin, this 1 mg per kg twice daily subcutaneously, and rest all of the drug doses should be with us whenever they are needed. We need to look up into the dose charts. Thank you.
Actually, all this has been incorporated in that booklet which is being made. That is that capacity building book. So I think the next time around, Siddharth, I think you just mentioned what is different, and don't hyperkalemia is almost the same except some differences. And
Yes.
also the sodium, you just see what you think is different, you can present that maybe, so that we
It's going till 15 minutes.
Yeah, we need to cut it down.
Yeah.
Otherwise it gets too much. So this is a good practice session for all
So
of us.
I can trim down this hypokalemia and this sodium and potassium part. It may take a lesser time.
Sure.
Thank you.
Anybody wants to say anything before we move to the next one? Okay, Maina, go ahead.
Hello.
Am I audible?
Ma'am.
Hello.
Yes.
Ma'am.
Who is this?
Ma'am, this is Amit, ma'am.
Yes, Amit. Yes, please tell me.
Can I present my 5 minutes presentation? I have to go. I'm actually ICU में जाना है, like बच्चे को stent होना. Just 5 minutes.
कर लो.
Thank you, ma'am.
आपका sedation का है ना?
Yes, ma'am. 5 minutes. I will take 5 minutes.
मना का allow कर देते हैं, please.
Maina, thank you.
Yes.
Slides are visible.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we will discuss an important aspect over these few minutes: sedation and analgesia in pediatric patients. So the basic question is, why do we need the sedation and analgesia in the patients? The first and foremost is the non-cooperative child. Many times we have to do many procedures, and a non-cooperative child will never allow us to do all the procedures, because many times we are not able to console the child properly about why exactly we are doing this procedure to the child. So the first and foremost thing is the non-cooperative child. Then again, sedation many times reduces the physiological responses to the stress. It avoids complications such as when the patient is on invasive ventilation. So it avoids complications like the removal of the mask when the patient is on oxygen therapy, or accidental extubation, or pulling out of some important venous access we have taken, or some arterial line access we have taken. So if we will properly sedate the patient when the patient is on some invasive ventilation, or he's having some invasive line, so this sedation will definitely prevent the child to remove the invasive lines and the invasive airway devices. Obviously, analgesia is required for the painful procedures, and many times the child is having some type of like spasmodic pain or other pain, then we have to give analgesia to the patient and complies with the mechanical ventilation by increasing it will increases our oxygenation therapy, and we can optimize the oxygen therapy while giving appropriate amount of sedation to the child. So to comment of these sedation and analgesia is when we are performing endotracheal intubation. To maintain the synchrony with the mechanical ventilation and providing routine intensive care, optimization of the oxygenation and the ventilation. And sometimes we need it, require it for procedural cooperation, that like chest physiotherapy and suctioning, painful procedures like placement of an intercostal drains or central venous line insertions, while we are doing bracing and removal of drains. So we require this analgesia for and as well as sedation for these purposes. These are few commonly used sedation agents. We are using benzodiazepines. We are using anesthetic agents like propofol and ketamine and dexmedetomidine. Trichlorophos can be given orally to these patients. Other sedation agents are like etomidate and thiopentone and clonidine. This clonidine is not available here, but yes, oral clonidine is now available. So, but this is usually not given because it causes a large amount of bradycardia and dryness of the oral secretions. So clonidine is usually not given. So we are mostly relying upon the midazolam and ketamine in pediatric patients, and many times if oral sedation, we are depending on trichlorophos. And not least to mention some analgesic agents like fentanyl, morphine, and ketamine. Ketamine, despite it's a good anesthetic agent as well as has a profound analgesia also. So we can this our purpose of providing analgesia as well as purpose of providing anesthesia both is solved with this ketamine. And for pain, we can give diclofenac in the usual doses. For local application like venipunctures, we can use Emla eutactic mixture of local anesthetic, which is a mixture of lidocaine and prilocaine cream. And for pain preparation, we can give paracetamol, which can give through oral route, or rectal route, or intravenous route. Thank you very much.
That was very short. Good.
Smith,
Yes, sir.
make sure dexmedetomidine is not available in our RCS2 because it is always being confused with the dexamethasone. So
Okay.
problem हो जाता है.
Agreed, sir. सही कह रहे सर.
Very true, very true.
Chalo. Sorry, Moinak, please come back.
Thank you very much. मैं जाना था, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Am I
Dr.
audible?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening. Practical tips for initiating inotropic vaccines. So we are discussing shock, and as you know, shock is a acute circulatory dysfunction where you have delivery of oxygen is limited and thereby the nutrients and metabolic demands are also unmet. There are three phases. The first phase is a compensated shock, which you know is tachycardia, but the blood pressure is normal. And this is one the phase where you know we are just cautious, but we don't do much. Second phase is the decompensated, where the patient is presented with hypertension, and this is where all our dynamic action takes place. And the third phase is the irreversible, where you end up failure. This is something we have to prevent. So we have to pick up the patients in compensated and decompensated state. So how do you recognize shock? We are going to go by the septic shock guidelines and for all practical purposes. Hello?
Next slides are not, we cannot see your slides.
Unstable connection.
Yeah, I think so.
I'll just change that connection.
Voice is also not very clear.
Yeah. I'll start over again. Am I audible now?
Yes, better.
Okay. So these are practical tips for initiating inotropic vaccinations. So shock, as you know, circulatory dysfunction where you have decreasing the demand of the delivery of oxygen and the nutrients, and hence there is a metabolic need. The three phases of shock: the compensated, decompensated, and irreversible. Compensated is when you have tachycardia but a normal BP. Decompensated is when you have hypotension, and this is exactly where we are going to focus. And irreversible is that stage where you have multi-organ failure. So it's important for us to pick up cases in the compensated and the decompensated phase before the patient lands up into an irreversible shock. So for all practical purposes, we are going to look at the septic shock and septic shock guidelines. Though we understand that in COVID pneumonia, not everything is going to be septic shock. So the management is going to mimic this. So decompensated shock is that shock where there's a tissue perfusion is not met. Then there is a phase of hypotension, and by hypotension, we mean that the systolic blood pressure is below 50 for inch. How to recognize somebody is in shock? So you have a background some kind of infection, and then you have maybe a hypothermia, tachycardia, tachypnea, altered mental status, decreased urine output, signs of warm and cold shock, and organ dysfunction. In isolated, each of these parameters don't actually qualify as shock. So you need to have 1, 2, or more of these parameters to qualify as shock. So how to know what is the fifth centile? This will be kept as a ready reference in the manuals. So the neonate will have systolic BP less than 60, infants less than 70. Children between 1 to 10 years, you have to calculate there. So it's 70 plus 2 into X. X is the age in years. Children above 10 years, it is less than 90. How to manage shock at the first time that you have contact with the patient? You have to obviously begin high flow oxygen because there will be tissue perfusion is going to be poor. You have to have a good IV access, and IV access sometimes becomes very challenging. When you have established an IV access, immediately you give an NS bolus of 40 ml per kg. And now earlier we used to give 60 ml per kg. Nowadays they've kept it down to 40 ml per kg. But basically what we used to do is to give 20 ml per kg 3 times up to 60 ml per kg. And then we used to look at the urine output. At the same time, you have to watch out for fluid overload, correct the hypoglycemia and hypocalcemia, and start off the antibiotics as per the protocol. If this does not work in the next 10 to 15 minutes, what you have to understand is that is possible fluid refractory state. In that situation, once again, now this time we probably need one more IV access and preferably a central IV access, which may be a little difficult in the first 15 minutes. You have to start off either adrenaline for a cold shock or noradrenaline if it's a warm shock. And if both of the two are not available, it's very unlikely because given our setup, adrenaline and noradrenaline is most of the times available in the crash cards. Then if these two are not available, then you can start a dopamine. If you have started it and you are not seeing a change, then you can increase by 20% almost every 15 minutes to the maximum permissible doses of adrenaline and noradrenaline. And if you have not still found a suitable blood pressure, then you can call it a catecholamine refractory shock. And here you have to add on hydrocortisone 2 mg per kg, or very rarely vasopressin. We will not talk about it. Persistent catecholamine resistant shock, you have to do pneumothorax and pericardial effusion. And remember, pneumothorax is a very important state, especially in COVID pneumonias. You must have seen when you've worked in the adult side. At this time's variant had presented with pneumomediastinum and pneumothorax spontaneous. Sometimes when you're overzealously bagging or intubating a child, then you might end up with a pneumothorax. So these two are very important states. Pericardial effusion can occur, especially with the MIS. So how do you identify warm shock? So basically it's hypotension, but paradoxically you get warm extremities, low diastolic pressure, bounding pulses. So don't be happy with the bounding pulses thinking that all is well. If you have a hypotension in the picture, then you're probably dealing with a warm shock. Cold shock is much more easier to pick up because you have hypotension with cold extremities. The dose of the inotropes are actually supposed to be titrated to reach a normal perfusion based on your mean arterial pressure and the CVP. The problem is you might not have a central venous access in the first hour. So this might not be a very practical situation. But if you do have this situation, then you might have to go by the formulas that are given. A more practical blood pressure goal is this small chart that also will be as a ready reckoner. So in infants, you must have a mean blood pressure of more than 40, up to 5, at 7 years 50, 12 years 55, and above 12 years more than 60 should be the target. What are the targets post resuscitation? In the first hour, you must restore and try and get normal heart rate. But in the presence of fever, sepsis, or even in MISC, where there's a cardiac problem going on, you might not get the proper heart rate. But very important, you must get your capillary refill less than 2 seconds, and you must try and get the blood pressure to a normotensive state. The therapeutic other endpoints are you must have a urine output more than 1 ml per kg per hour. Try and get a mental status that is normal, but mental status will depend on whatever baseline electrolytes are abnormal, or if the patient has a concomitant meningoencephalitis, whatever it is. And you must always make sure that the glucose concentration and the ionized concentration, calcium concentration comes to normal. In MISC, there will be an additional problem that it's not the septic shock, but it's a cardiogenic shock, and there's a cardiac failure. Here again, the same goal, same therapy, same way to treat. First line is epinephrine. Second line is alternatively non-epinephrine. The other options are dobutamine and dopamine. If you have a severe myocardial dysfunction and you're having fluid overload state, then you should consider diuretics, small doses, or milrinone, but we have hardly come across that state. And you must avoid fluid overload in such a scenario. These drug doses, most important of these two of this list is epinephrine, non-epinephrine, and hydrocortisone. The rest of it will be available as ready reckoner, but always remember epinephrine is 0.05 to 1 mics per kg per hour. Non-epinephrine is 0.01 to 1 mics per kg per minute, and hydrocortisone is 2 mg per kg bolus followed by 1 mg per kg per dose. That's all I have to show. If I've missed anything, maybe Banani ma'am or Upasana, you can fill it up. Upasana, you want to say something?
No, sir.
Ma'am, have I covered or?
Yes, enough. I think that is enough, because I think it's very easy to say it here, but when you are actually faced with the situation, that is when this will come handy. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Who is next, Kirti?
Lakshmi answer. I think we will talk on feeding and nutrition.
Yeah.
My slides visible?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, very good evening. I think let's talk about something about feeding and nutrition, which is easier part. I think before each and every child who will come to the RCS2, the plotting of the growth is most important, because that will help in fluid calculation, drugs calculation per kg. So that is the most important thing. And where he falls, and basically we have two growth charts, 1 to 5 years and 5 to 8 years. 1 to 5 years and 5 to 18 years difference is only head circumference is there in 1 to 5 years, because that is important at that age group. And 5 to 18 years, weight and height is there, where we can calculate BMI and where the child stands, malnourished or obese. Coming to the feeding part, I think if the child is on breastfeed less than 6 months, he must be continued with his breastfeeding. And we must ensure to the parents and mother that it must be given until date no active virus has been detected in the breast milk, so it must be continued. And the child who is more than 6 months, the complementary feeding must be continued appropriate for the age. And if the child is on breastfeed after 6 months, it must be also continued. And all the complementary foods which are appropriate, safe, adequate, and acceptable to the child and available in the RCS2 to be given. And whenever the breastfeeding is not possible, I think express breast milk can be tried. And if the breast milk, express breast milk is not available, then we can go for the formula. Maybe we will get lactogen 1-2 formula in the RCS2. Coming to the calculation of calories and fluid in the children, which is Holiday and Sager formula. We all know that first 10 kg, it is 100 calorie per for each kg, then 50 for the next 10 kg, then 20 for the another 10 kg. So in children, generally calorie requirement is calculated by the expected weight, not ideal weight, and fluid by the present weight. But in adults, we calculate both by for the present weight. So whatever the calorie requirement is there is Harris-Benedict equation. When we correct the correction factor is added to the required calorie amount. Like if the baby is febrile, we can add 12% of per degree increase above 37. So like if there is 2 degree increase in fever, so 24% increase in the caloric will be there. In ARDS, which will be seeing in RCS2 and sepsis, 20% and 10 to 30% increase in above and normal requirement will be required. Of course, will not require their trauma and surgery. These cases will not there. Coming to the energy distribution, it will be normal as 50 to 60% of the carbohydrate, protein 10 to 50%, maybe more during recovery phase. Fat requirement 25 to 45, 20-25 initial phases. In recovery phases, it goes to the 40-45%, and the vitamins and mineral requirement, recommended allowances, and later on maybe more may be needed. Coming to the which route of feeding should be administered, mostly if the oral route is available, you must go for that. And the newborns and small children must be encouraged for the nutritive and non-nutritive sucking in them. If the oral route is not available, then tube feeding must be tried, like orogastric one-time feed or nasogastric for short time, like 2 to 3 days. Nasojejunal is rarely required whenever we cannot repeated vomiting increase, and there is other factors available along with that, like critically sick child who is placed prone for the management and increased risk of diarrhea, risk of vomiting. So there the post-pyloric feed can be tried. Regarding parenteral nutrition, for short term, you can go for the peripheral parenteral nutrition and the TPN. It is very important to note that very critically sick child and child with MIS-C, we should not go for the TPN for the first 1 week. We should avoid. So for the first 1 week in TPN, instead of TPN, we give them the just micronutrients and the fluids. So what are the types of food to be given? Of course, the older child, normal foods, which is pot feeding available, whatever it should be given. For small children, semi-solid food like milk and milk-based foods, juices, some restricted, and rice curd can be given. And other liquids like soup, fruit juices, egg flip milk, and milk-based diets and high energy milk can be advised. And for more calorie and protein requirements, we can, if the child is not able to take the solid foods or semi-solid foods, we can go for the polymeric formulas. And even if the polymeric formula is not digestible, sometimes we may go for the semi-elemental formula for more caloric and protein intake. The elemental formula is really required. Maybe if we can get the child who is having the multiple food allergy or having the milk allergy, who is diagnosed with the COVID, maybe you have to continue with them. So we can give all this tube feeding by bolus or continuous. Of course, the bolus is the physiological, and continuous food should be given very slowly, and so that there is no, in children with nausea, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. So in there it is beneficial, and it allows the maximum absorption. So this is just an example of model light in 5 years old child who is 18 kg, 40, like he will have around 1400 kilocalorie per day requirement with, and if he's on RDS, again 280, it will comes around 1680. His protein requirement will be around at 2 gram per kg, 35, and his fat requirement will be around 50 ml, so around 25 ml will be given on topping fat requirement. So by oral means we can give the milk products, other eggs, normal feed, and fruits, vegetables, and combination of these foods. If he is not able to take the orally, tube feed can be given. In tube feed, he can be given like churn diet with some amount, and some amount by polymeric diet, that is Ensure formula we are getting in our institute. But we can have more better formula which is more caloric dense, because Ensure is 1 calorie per ml formula, and Peptamen Junior can have the 1.5 calorie per ml formula. So when we have the less amount to be given and more calories, so this Peptamen Junior can be helpful. So coming to the nutritional requirements in the acute pediatric critical illness, during acute stable and recovery phase, you can say in the interim nutrition, if the interim nutrition to be given, it is recommended that to commence within 24 hours of admission, if not content indicated. Like content indications are inadequate perfusion and there is rising lactate. So here we cannot give the enteral nutrition. And the protein will be in the enteral nutrition will be very low, around 1 to 2 gram per kg. In the stable phase, it will be around 2 to 3 gram per kg. In the recovery phase, for the catch-up growth, we can give the 3.3 to 4 gram per kg. In the parenteral nutrition, the protein is not given in the first week of life. And the stable phase 1 to 2 gram, in the recovery phase 2 to 3 gram. Likewise, the energy caloric requirement is the less than resting energy requirement is given. Later on, it will increase around 1.3 to 1.5 times of resting energy expenditure. And in the recovery phase, it is given around 2 times. Like GIR rate for the sugar, we can give around as per formula, which is told by Siddharth. So this is the flow chart for the MIS-C or critical child. So initial assessment by nutritional status, weight, length, midterm, circumference, and if the child is
weight पता लग जाए वही बहुत है, कहाँ कौन midterm circumference.
So if the child is hemodynamically unstable or contraindicated, so then the enteral instead of TPN, we can give the just glucose infusion and the micronutrient and vitamins. But on the later, we should always reconsider the child to start the enteral nutrition if possible in coming days. So if the child is acute and stable, then we can start the resting energy expenditure energy and increase gradually to match the resting energy expenditure, and later on we can increase that. So after 7 days, we can start in TPN if the child is not matching the required amount, and then with the TPN, then again we can see for the enteral nutrition can be started or not, and later on we can basically increase the food on oral nutrition. Thank you. Anything to be added or
No, I just think you should not talk about TPN at all. This is a very acute phase, and if TPN has to be given, then we should,
Yeah, I
just-
have not gone into details. That's why
no,
I've
don't
just,
even talk about it. Just say that we are going to give plain IV fluids.
yeah,
And
yeah.
if at all the patient cannot be fed for 7 days, then we will consider TPN, at which time we will discuss it then and there. Let us not talk of TPN. I think that is better. It will make it simple.
Okay, thank you.
Hmm. So we have only one talk left. Before you start, Akash, I just want to say, what time do we want to start tomorrow? 3 o'clock is good.
3:30.
Any practical fee of
Practical, I think 3 is better, Akash, because
Okay, ma'am.
it will take 1.5 to 2 hours. See, even today we have exceeded 1.5 hours.
Okay, ma'am.
What do the others say?
Yes,
Everybody
ma'am.
agrees?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I have made and circulated in the group who is supposed to come tomorrow and who is supposed to come day after. And among the people who are teaching, you can keep it such that one team teaches tomorrow and one team teaches day after, so that the same person doesn't get bored. Right? Okay, please go ahead, Akash.
Now coming to the last presentation of the day. Although majority of children do well without oxygen, and some who go on to require oxygen do well without BiPAP or ventilator setting. Very few, that is less than 2%, require BiPAP and ventilation for maintaining oxygen and ventilation. Now coming to the BiPAP, BiPAP is just similar to CPAP, but it provides 2 levels of pressure, and which is given by a mask which covers the nose and the mouth. And here in this picture, these are the pediatric BiPAP masks which are available with us, and it can be used. They come with different sizes, and depending on the age group, we can select different sizes which fit snugly. The indications include whenever a child has hypercarbia or hypoxemia, which in a child, hypercarbia is defined when PCO2 goes above 50, and hypoxemia is defined when PO2 is less than 60. Apart from these, if child is hypoxemic despite giving oxygen by other means, which we have already discussed, like reservoir bag, HFNC, or bubble CPAP, then we must shift that child to a higher mode of oxygen delivery. First BiPAP, and if BiPAP is not successful, then we must ventilate. The initial settings, as we already discussed, that there are 2 pressures which have to be set. The IPAP is usually set at 8 to 12 centimeters of water, and EPAP is usually set between 3 to 5. Remember that the difference between these 2 pressures is usually 4 to 5. Other thing which we have to set in BiPAP or ventilation is FiO2, and in neonates, we have to maintain a saturation between 90 to 95, and in older children, the saturation should be more than 94. Once we have started a child on BiPAP, if the child continues to have respiratory distress, he is hypoxemic, we are delivering a less tidal volume, which is ideally should be above 5 ml per kg, or if the patient continues to fight or shows asynchrony with the ventilator, that is an indication that our settings are not adequate and we need to go high on pressures. Now, this chart shows the initial settings as per the age group. And as the age increases, the pressures requirement increases. Usually for infants, we start with IPAP of 8 to 12 and EPAP of 4 to 8. And in adolescents, the pressures can be as high as 15 to 20 centimeters of water. But remember that in infants and neonates, that is a child who is less than 1 year of old, 1 year of age, CPAP is all that is required. And if child who is less than 1 year fails CPAP, he should be ventilated. Coming to the mechanical ventilation, indications remain the same. If child remains hypercarbic or hypoxemic, despite giving maximum support on BiPAP or NIV. Other indications include altered consciousness, which can be defined as GCS less than 8, or child is not tolerating BiPAP. That is an indication when we need to shift child to mechanical ventilation. In order to keep things simple, we have selected one mode for all age groups, that is SIV with pressure control. If particular ventilator does not have pressure control, that is PSV, we may start with simple SIV mode. Again, once a child is ventilated, that means child is sick. So we start with a high FiO2 of 100 and then titrate to maintain saturation, target saturation, depending on the age group. Our target delivery of tidal volume should be between 5 to 6 ml per kg. And the knobs which we have to set in a ventilator includes PIP, that is peak inspiratory pressure, PEEP, TI and rate. Remember that TI and rate are usually set once and we don't need to change them frequently. So it is only between PIP and FiO2 which has to be changed frequently. Now for a neonate, we usually start with pressures of 16 to 18, and as the child age increases, the pressure requirement also increases. So for a child who is more than 1 kg, the requirement is usually between 18 to 20, and for an adolescent, it may be anywhere between 20 to 22. The PIP is said to be adequate if there is chest rise, which can be seen by standing at the bedside of a child. The chest rise should be just visible. It should not be a jumping chest. If the child shows a jumping chest, that means we are giving excess of pressures. If there is no chest rise and there is no obstruction like secretions, that means we are giving inadequate PIP. Coming to the PEEP, we usually start with 5 and go up to 8, depending on the age group. Again, the indication for delivering an adequate PEEP is that there should be no retractions. The chest expansion should be good. Remember that if you give high PEEP, there may be CO2 retention and there may be decreased cardiac output because of the decreased venous return. TI is usually set between 0.3 to 0.7, and once set, it is usually not changed. Same is true for the rate. Now coming to the optimal settings, if despite being on ventilation for 10 to 15 minutes, child's vitals are not improving, then something needs to be wrong and we should check for it. Usually the patient either fights, he's not properly sedated, he may have fever, or there may be secretions which are interfering with delivery of the pressures. So all these things should be looked for when we are not achieving normalization of vital signs. Again, as discussed, look for adequate chest rise. Don't give excess PEEP. Saturation, if the child continues to be hypoxemic, increase FiO2. And once the saturation goes beyond 95 in neonates and beyond 98 in older children, we should come down on FiO2 by 5 every 5 to 10 minutes. PEEP and PIP is usually increased in steps of 1 to 2 to achieve adequate settings, as already discussed. And for delivering tidal volume, we usually set a target of 6 in older children and 4 to 5 in neonates. If there is low tidal volume or low minute ventilation, that means we need to go on increase the PIP. But do check tubes for leaks, especially near the humidifier or the patient end. Sometimes because of the excessive atelectasis and collapse, the chest may have a poor compliance and it takes some time to get an adequate FRC. And before increasing pressures to get an adequate chest rise, look for any kink in the tube, and there should be no visible secretions in the AT tube. If they are there, then only one should do suctioning, otherwise no need of doing routine suctioning. Thank you. Any changes required?
I think thank you. Does any of the participants want to speak something or have any queries can ask to any of us?
बबल सिप इसमें नहीं है ना?
Bubble CPAP oxygen delivery devices may, I think Anita, you have covered it. We will be demonstrating it in the practical session.
Okay.
Okay, I think then we can close the session. Thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to see you in the practical session tomorrow and day after tomorrow. Thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Vidya, we can close now, I think.